And remind you that there's a sign up sheet over there. If you'd like to bring goodies in the future, put your name down and we'll contact you. And also too, I'm not sure if I did this last time or maybe Thomas did at the last meeting. I'd like to recognize Sylvia Andrews, who is our new PAHS or PAHS representative on the state level PAHS education committee. I'd like to thank Sylvia. And it's volunteers that make PAHS a success. I'd like to make a few announcements about future events, and then we'll get to our guest speaker. Saturday, April 22nd, Thomas Elliott, our vice president, will be leading a PAHS hidden library tour. Put this date on your calendar for this one-day special tour that will acquaint you with the resources that are hidden in plain sight, but available to everyone. The tour will visit the special collections in the Rawlings Library, photos and historical documents of the Pueblo County Historical Society upstairs, the life cycle of the steel mill, mines, and business operations in the CF&I Steelworks archives, and also the PCC library. If you're interested in that, you can contact Thomas right there. Let him know that you're interested in that field trip. And I think there's still a few openings. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, there you go. Saturday, April 29th, 1 p.m. is the CAS quarterly meeting right here in the Pueblo Heritage Museum. PAHS welcomes representatives of the Colorado Archaeological Society to Pueblo for the CAS, or the Colorado Archaeological Society quarterly meeting. PAHS members are automatically members of CAS and are welcome to attend. Quarterly meetings of the society are held at various locations across the state to ensure that all chapters and interested members of the society have an opportunity to meet in person. At these meetings, the current state of the society is reviewed and reports from various chapters are heard as well as represented. Excuse me. Again, all are welcome to attend. You don't, if you're a PAHS member, you can come to the CAS meeting and see what's going on at the state level. May is Archaeology and Historic Preservation Month, and to help celebrate, at our next meeting on Thursday, May 4th, our featured speaker will be state historian, Dr. Jared Orsi, author of the new book, Citizen Explorer, The Life of Zebulon Pike. In Citizen Explorer, historian Jared Orsi provides the first modern biography of this soldier, Pike, an explorer, who rivaled contemporaries Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Born in 1779, Pike joined the Army and served in frontier posts in the Ohio River Valley before embarking on a series of astonishing expeditions. He sought the headwaters of the Mississippi and later sources, the Arkansas and Red Rivers, which led him to what is now Colorado and Pikes Peak, although he called it James Peak. A stay here in Pueblo, and also he stayed here in Pueblo and was later captured by Spanish forces in the San Luis Valley. Next month's meeting, and remember this, will be at the Rawlings Library, not here at the Heritage Museum. It'll be on the 4th floor in the Riles room. And also, we are planning other activities in honor of Archaeological and Historic Preservation Month. And so watch your emails, and those will be announcing the events that we have coming up. Also in honor of Historical and Archaeology and Historical Preservation Month, our book discussion group will be reading Dr. Orsi's book, Citizen Explorer, The Life of Zebulon Pike. And you have plenty of time to read it. The date will be, I didn't put the date on here. Catherine, what was the date? Thank you. May 22nd. which is a Monday. So you have plenty of time to get the book. I'm just about finished it, and it is really interesting, and it gives you a different perspective on Pike and kind of the history and the intrigue, politics, and the intrigue that was going on at the time of Pike's expedition. Let's see. Okay, that's it. I'd like to now introduce Spencer Little. Spencer is the past. Spencer is the past vice president of PAHS and has recently been actively involved in field work while pursuing his master's degree in archaeology at Colorado State University, Fort Collins. Spencer is a sixth-generation resident of the Arkansas Valley, grew up in Wetmore, where his father taught him the value of ancestral historical perspectives. Now Spencer is applying these lessons and pursuing an MA in archaeology from Colorado State University, Fort Collins. Before making this move, Spencer worked as the director of the Pueblo Heritage Museum. He is involved in professional archaeological research across the state, including Fremont Pinnacle Research in Rio Blanco County, reanalysis of legacy collections excavated by Colorado University and Colorado State University, and fieldwork documenting the cultural resources at multiple public lands within Larimer County. Additionally, Spencer is involved in volunteer and personal pet projects, including rock art documentation in Southeast Colorado with PAHS, historical archaeology on the Overland Trail with the Northern Colorado chapter of PAHS, and has persistent interest in research into passive hunting technology and snares, meaning snares and traps, which is really interesting. You should talk to him about that sometime. And also Southern Plains village cultures. Beyond archaeology, Spencer has an interest in art, poetry, dreaming, string figures, and magic. And we're hoping maybe he has a magic trick after his talk. Is that right, Spencer? Okay, a poem works too. Welcome, Spencer Little.
All right. Thanks, everybody. I'm so tickled. Everybody being here. My audio's coming through, I guess. Yes. Okay. Yeah, like I was just telling Doug, I mean, I am going to get into all my thesis research here, but since I have a captive audience, and you guys are kind of going to be sitting here with me, regardless of what I say, I'm going to start with a poem. This is a poem by John Nisley, who's a really good friend of mine up in Fort Collins. Some of the themes and the ideas, you know, they touch on the way I think of the world and I think of the archaeological record and the way the environment has such great agency and how really there's only the present moment, even though we're so interested in the past, right? So you'll catch some of that, but I'll let the poem speak for itself and then we'll get into the weeds here. Okay. This poem is called Convalescence. It's by John Nisley. Deep breaths. Carry your empty bucket to the well. Maybe there's a way of rooting the self in light again, of lowering the rope slowly, of hearing the splash echo off stone, of feeling the weight of the evening sun running through water filling to the brim. Look at your past faces and all their weariness reflected here. The selves you were always pained to see, erasing into ripples, then into nothing. You are of the present now. Where to pull the rope down is to pull the sun up. Where to set the bucket on the ground is to remember how to grow grace from seed. Soon, you will learn to ask the water's permission to drink, the grass to rest your feet, the sky to open into the well where lichen tents it cloudlessly and tirelessly green. Oh, thank you, everybody. I feel much more centered after that. Okay, now we'll get into the archaeology stuff. So I'm going to be talking about my thesis research, which has been focused on reanalyzing the Hell's Midden collection. This is a site in northwestern Colorado that was dug by the University of Colorado in the 1940s. And so for the last year and a half or so, I've been working with the collections, working with the archives at this site. This is a photo of one portion of the site. You can see it's this large mound. We'll have some more photos. But yeah, that's just the first one that we have there. So here is basically the outline of my presentation. First, I'm going to talk about the history of investigations. I previously gave a talk to the Boulder chapter of PAHS, which focused exclusively on the history, but I'm going to try to go through it a little more quickly this time, and then talk about the questions that I had reanalyzing this for my thesis, which are, how old is the site? It's this really deep sequence of occupational history there, but it hasn't been dated. So that was one of the main goals of my research here, was getting absolute dates from the site, radiocarbon dates. And then I was really interested because the top parts of the site have Fremont agriculturalist occupations, right? It came in about 1000 AD, give or take a couple hundred years. The underlying sequence is all this hunter-gatherer archaic stuff. My questions is kind of related to, we have this idea of the Neolithic revolution, that farming takes off and all of a sudden people get really interested in living in square-shaped villages and making pottery and all of this stuff and staying year-round at places. But I was curious, do we have evidence here in those pre-agricultural horizons of kind of similar settlement strategies, of revisiting the same place year after year for seasonal resource procurement or that? So yeah, we'll get into all of those topics. I have another blank slide just for us to all take a deep breath together again. Okay. So Hell's Midden, I need to point with this laser, I guess. You can see right here, everybody see my laser there, and at home I'm hoping. Hell's Midden is located at the mouth of Hell's Canyon, which is one of two access points, the other being Red Rock Canyon, to this area called Castle Park. You can see in this cutaway, this is located within Dinosaur National Monument on the Yampa River, far northwestern Colorado. This is in Moffat County. The nearest town would be like Maybell or Craig. But Castle Park is this real low-lying area with just really lush soils compared to the rest of the surrounding environment. It has high temperatures. It's a really suitable place to be settling in, whether you're a human or a wild carrot or a deer. It's just a really favorable condition compared to the rest of this canyon country. You see, I have a basic timeline along the edge. Interest in this part of the state really started with Mantle's Cave, which I'll show some artifacts here in a moment. But the Jones Lee were a couple of artifact collectors who lived in Boulder. And in 1939, they dug out a cache from this Mantle's Cave site that contained fish hooks, snares, all of this stuff contained in a beautiful basket inside of a stone-lined pit. They donated this cache to Earl Morris, who was at the University of Colorado. CUMNH. That's, I just got some echo here. I don't know. Something changed with the audio. Okay, anyhow. Sorry, gang. CUMNH is the University of Colorado Museum of Natural History. So these artifacts were brought there in 1939. Within a couple of months, museum staff went out to the Mantle's Ranch that had a lot of this Castle Park area to inquire about doing some archaeological investigation. So that was November of 39. The next month in December, two students, Chili Scoggin and Edison Lohr, were sent out to Castle Park for 6 months, and they recorded sites across this Castle Park region. And you can see 16 of their sites that they recorded on this map here, Hell's Midden being one of them. Berg revisited in 47, and then two field schools returned in 1948 and 49, which is where the majority of our data comes from. Yes. And it's hard for me to speak because it's delayed somewhat. I'm sorry if I'm sounding. I'm trying to push through here. Okay. So here's the site. You can see Edison Lohr. You'll see this figure here standing with a 10-foot stadia rod there. This mound feature is the site, Hell's Midden. This is where the main area of excavation was focused. There's a ditch running along the base of this mound, which was built about 1908. And even though they were looking for these incredible perishable cave sites, which I'll show examples of, Hell's Midden was recognized on the first day of them being there, and you can see this note. He was talking just before in his field journals here, I got this. He was talking in his field journals, oh, the Manners family has been so hospitable to us, and this evening we were noodling around, and man, we found all these artifacts coming out of this site. Unfortunately, the site's not a midden, as we'll get to, but we're stuck with the name because that's what the first excavators thought. They hypothesized there was a village up on top of this ledge and that all their refuse formed this midden. It was actually a primary occupation surface, which we'll get into. But this quote, I mean, this just gave me chills. That this is a treasure chest, to be sure. This was a good nod for me to press on with my research. So in that first 1940s session, they dug kind of on the far upstream edge of the midden. Basically behind this tree here is where Scoggin and Lohr focused their units. With no vertical control, they kind of went in from the ditch, you can see, and just cut into that wall. But you can see some pretty well-defined strats on this back, just behind Ed Lohr there, showing that the site has, you know, some integrity that could show this sequence of occupation along the Yampa River. Trouble is, we didn't know for how long that had lasted. But so here's 1940. Yeah, still got the echo. So there's a before and after photo. Here in 1947, what happened, Cherry Scoggin went to the war and he was killed in World War II. So research wasn't able to continue and he wasn't able to report on all of his work there. And the Park Service, the recently expanded Dinosaur National Monument, was really pressuring the museum, hey, you got to get a report out. I know you want to come out here and dig some more, but tell us, what did you do for 6 months over 1940? So Robert Berg, who was the assistant to the director, he's standing right here. He thought, well, I need to go test these deposits myself. So rather than digging here, he went up to the height, the crest of the midden, which is behind where he's standing in this photo. He identified all of these cultural strats, basically continuous sequence of occupation, best he could tell. That fixed it. Best he could tell. Here's some photos. He writes in his journal, oh man, I had to clean up in the rain and I ran out to take these photos, so they're not great quality. But that's the kind of trench he dug, ultimately to a depth of 10 feet. And he was within this tiny little telephone box at the bottom. You see why he quit. But in 1948, that was the big year. CU returned as a field school under Robert Lister, who is here. This is Berg's trench from 1947. They expanded this to be 2 meters across, ultimately 10 meters north to south, cutting across the entire extent of the midden and exposing this large profile, which we will show in just a moment. 1949, field school returned, and you can see how they put their units adjacent to that, or perpendicular rather, to that 1948 trench. And they were digging against the shelter wall, which you can see at the left of these couple of photos. And they moved a lot of dirt. So here's kind of how all those units line up roughly together. This is the extent of the midden as recorded in 1940. That's where that first excavation was. This is Berg's little test trench. Great big trench dug in 48, and then the 49 field school. You can see the amount of material that they excavated from this site is pretty astounding. These chipstone artifacts are almost all tools. They excavated another 10,000 flakes or bits of debitage from the site, but those weren't collected ultimately. So we're left with about 900 stone tools and 1,100 other little pieces. 3,000 screen. Okay, beautiful. Yeah, in addition, a lot of bone artifacts, so fair preservation for a more or less exposed site. Lots of awls, dice for playing some kind of gambling game, you know, snare slides, all this. A lot of groundstone artifacts, including a really cool pipe that Chile and Edison lore dug out in the 40s. Lots of features, and we'll get to all that stuff. But overall, 4.5 meters of cultural deposits at this site, very well stratified and basically continuous. And like I say here, all this area of the site potentially remains. I've never visited this site. This trench was never backfilled, so God knows what happened to it since then. But in theory, there's this much more of the site that could be explored in the future. Oh, now my clicker. Yeah, what did I do? I unmuted myself. Why'd he do that?
Fingers.
Yeah. It won't let me out of this window to hit.
Do this.
Yeah, maybe if I click. Oh, it's touchscreen. Oh, okay, good enough. All right.
This new stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
So here's that beautiful profile that was exposed from that large north-south trench dug in 1948. As you can see along the, particularly on the back wall, under the shelter, the drip line of that, you know, some relatively shallow shelter is right here about in section C. You can see behind that, you have all of these fire features, potential storage pits, hard packed living surfaces down to a depth of about 2.5 meters here. This level here with charcoal and ash is the lowest at 4.5 meters that has evidence of occupation. And below that, it's really just all churned up river stuff. But this is basically the surface of the river plain that just surrounds that whole area. So most of this was built up by human occupation at the site, which is pretty incredible. This is the way that Bob Lister, who wrote a report on the site in 1951, this is how he broke it up. He considered the top 2 meters or so to be the horticultural stage. This is what we would now identify, and they identified with Fremont occupation in this region. So these were agriculturalist Native American groups living there. Huge explosion in the density of the materials for those upper levels. But that's basically these features that you see here were the beginning of that occupation, of that agriculturalist occupation. I'll refer to that as upper. And then for the lower, it's what he called this hunting gathering stage. And you have marked drop in density of the cultural materials and a change, right? No more arrow points and things like that. You get more of these big dart points and spear points, but some groundstones, some caches, some really interesting stuff that we'll get to. So my next few slides will describe these deposits. But first, if you let me indulge, oh, that cut off. Oh, well, if you let me indulge in some archaeopoetics, this artifact to me speaks to the entire site. This site is showing this record of continued reoccupation, right? And this artifact is far out, if you'll stick with me for just a minute. So this is a pumpkin chert. And when the pumpkin chert gets exposed to, you know, certain environmental conditions, it gets this red patina on it. Okay, so when you first break the rock, you get this nice orange color, and that lasts until this red patina kind of shows up. What we have here is an artifact that right here, you can see this core. So that was busted off a piece of pumpkin chert, God knows how long ago, right? That tool was then used, and somebody chucked it over their shoulder. Oh, I'm done using that. A long time later, long enough for this patina to form, someone else picked it up and they resharpened it. And we have all these thinning flakes on its opposite edge. Then they used that edge once again. And then they chucked it over their shoulder and it landed at the Hell's Midden site. And 4.5 meters of sediment filled in on top of this thing. So this artifact, if everybody's tracking, shows a very ancient sequence of use just in its form alone. But then it was found 4.5 meters at the bottom of this thing. So as I say, this artifact is as old as the dirt which formed this site. I think that is way cool. This, I think that's way cool. This is the deepest unequivocal artifact from the site for sure. There's some stone balls and stuff that other people said, I don't really buy it, but that's why I'm reanalyzing, I guess. Oh, more of it got cut off. I built this thing in PowerPoint 2010, and now I'm on a new computer. So this is the lower sequence. As you can see, about 2 meters to 3.5 meters below the surface of really well-defined strats. There's some more ephemeral stuff below that. But the point types we see are Mallory points up here is a well-known plains type. Pinto points, which are spread out all across the Great Basin and basically all the way through time. And then these more Elko points. Trouble with this, as you all know, artifacts, a lot of times projectile points can be kind of index fossils, and we can guess how old the site is just by the style. In the Great Basin, it is so messy. In particular, here in the northern Colorado Plateau, you have this kind of convergence. It's the intersection between the Northwest Plains and the Great Basin. And so you have these two different series of point typologies that make it really, really difficult to get any kind of temporal diagnostic off of these artifacts, which is why dating is so important. This lower sequence, though, also has living floors. You can see here a plan view of one of those living floors, and caches. Here's a cache of 5 ground stones, all shaped into that kind of classic loaf shape. And this probably speaks to, you know, seasonal processing of plant foods at this site. I'm going to talk a lot about the caches in my conclusion here. So just keep that in mind, that people are storing stuff here so they can come back and use it in the future. Now the upper sequence, what we now call the, the Fremont occupation of the site, we have pottery. You can see here a big busted vessel. That was the most shallow or the most recent evidence of Fremont occupation. It was found directly associated with some corn that I was able to date in this project. More caches of just kind of balls, not even artifacts or bifaces, just nice tool stone that would be there for whoever wanted to turn that into an artifact later. You can say all these bone tools, little tiny pieces of very finely made textiles. I mean, really finely twill weave, I think. I'm not a textile person, I don't know. But this pipe, and then you see this pipe fragment, that thing is so cool. Other stuff, this upper sequence really well relates to other sites in Castle Park. A lot of those caves were very famous for the perishable artifacts. I would argue this flicker feather headdress is one of the most famous artifacts found in our state, just because it's so beautifully preserved. You have the feathers from about 70 flicker feathers at minimum used to build this. You have the orange flicker feathers on the one side, yellow on the middle. Some people have made a big deal about this being a plains variant of the flicker and a Great Basin variant. And then this ermine feather thing. This has been dated multiple times, lands right about 950 AD, thereabout. Meanwhile, it was cached directly with this doe skin headdress in these clearly Fremont-made caches. I mean, the way the stone line pits are made, the way other artifacts associated with that were dated, it shows Fremont. This thing's 2,000 years older. This dates to about 3,000 years ago, which is weird. What does that mean? Some people say, oh, well, it was like a museum or something. I don't know. I think the Fremont folks were probably going to caves in this area. If stuff is well preserved for archaeologists to discover today, surely it was then too. So they've probably found this in some other cave and thought, man, that's really cool. I'm going to take that home and add that to my ritual paraphernalia. Other things you see are granaries, which is really diagnostic of these Uinta Fremont, where they're storing food, mostly to keep away, it seems like, from other humans more than rats and things like that, but that was probably a piece of it. And then these kind of dumbbell looking corn cobs. Nobody knows what those are about, but find those all over the place too. My question here that got cut off, why do we have all this Fremont in the caves, but you don't have any of that hunter-gatherer stuff that's shown in the lower sequence at Hell's Midden? I'm going to get into that. I have an idea. Probably wrong, but I have an idea. And then the final upper level, about 4 centimeters below the surface, is the Pat Lynch horizon, the hermit of Pat's Hole. And you can see his quote up here, if in those caverns you shelter take, please do to them no harm. Leave everything you find around hanging up or on the ground. He'd written that inside one of his caves to say, hey, you know, I'm living here. I'm planning to return. Like, don't mess with my canteen or my bullets, please. And Pat Lynch, we know he was around because here's a P. It's hard to make out, but he would carve this monogram all over rock art sites in the region. He was also a whaler and worked in the U.S. Navy, and he would carve these ship glyphs right over big Fremont rock art sites. So he's obviously there. You can see that Pat Lynch level, just real discreet right up top here. So there's, yeah, that's the upper sequence basically. Lower sequence down to here is really well stratified. Below that, you still have it, but it's a little more ephemeral. So now we're getting to my research questions. How old are the deposits at this site, right? And how sedentary were these occupants through time? So on the how old is the site, you know, we want proof that these dates, that it's contemporary to the other cave sites and these other Mannel's Cave and Marigold's Cave and these other places that have been very well dated. This region is just totally overrepresented, maybe not overrepresented, it's probably true, but the radiocarbon dates from that area are overwhelmingly Fremont. I mean, they just left such a mark on that place, and that's where a lot of people's research focus has been. So we have a ton of Fremont dates from Castle Park. None until this work of those earlier occupations, right? The other question with that, you have about 2 meters, 1.5 meters of Fremont occupation at the top part of the site. How much time was that? Was that Fremont and other places? The overall range is maybe 200 AD to 1300, something like that. Could this be a whole 1,000-year span? Or is their use of Castle Park much more discrete in time? Other sites there seem to say it is. Does Hell's Midden bear that out? And then are these deposits really continuous? Can we see the transition, right? That Neolithization moment. Can you see when these corn farmers move in and change the lifeways there? Or is there going to be some gap that'll fiddle with us? Yes, there's a gap that fiddles with us. And then how sedentary were they through time? Did the Fremont make this great just switch over to sedentism and intensive use of these sites? And before that, it was just all these wandering groups. Or was that kind of the pattern of use at Castle Park through time? So starting with number one, I got selected radiocarbon samples from the assemblage. We got 3 corn dates from the site, all at different levels within that upper Fremont horizon. 10 bone samples up to a depth of 3.5 meters from the site. So we get some pretty resolute, more resolute than anything before, you know, dates for this site. Those were sent off to University of Georgia for data, for getting dating. And then we ran some basic stats on them. And we'll get into that now. So here's the results of my dates. You can see this is the upper portion. So we have a kind of early date, about 500 AD, but these other ones cluster pretty well between 800 and 1200 AD. So that looks pretty good. That is kind of to be expected with the other Castle Park dates, right? But in the lowest, we have a big gap. So this is 500 AD or so, and then we don't pick it back up until about 900 BC. So we have a large gap of, 1,500 years or so between these two things. So what's going on there, right? My thought is that Fremont occupation at this site was so intensive that they may have just erased those, what were at the time, those topmost levels, right? That period dating after 1000 BC, there were probably artifacts and all kinds of things, but they were digging features, digging fire pits, picking up artifacts from the site. I only have so many dates, so more dates could help see if there really is that gap, but it seems like that's the case. But overall, the site shows us 4,500 years of occupation between about 3,700 BC and 1200 there. So just to put that back into there. So yeah, this lower level here, right about 3700 BC. This top contact surface right here, about 700 BC or that. And then a big gap, 700 BC to 600 AD, we have a break in the stratigraphy right at these features. So like I say, more dates could help us figure that out. But darn, because that's the thing you want to see. How did the Fremont people moving in, how did that work? Was that a new group moving in? Was that the hunter-gatherers living there who just adopted corn technology? It's really, that's the part you want to see, but it's just elusive across the archaeological record. Okay, the next question is, how sedentary were these folks through time? So what I did for this was I selected several variables. You can see them listed on the side. I won't go into all of those, but I quantified all of these things so that I could try to make them directly comparable. Because each year we had those 4 excavation seasons, each one used different level designations, so it really got hairy. So I had to compare the 2 field school seasons separately. But basically we lined those all up, percent ranked them on Excel, which you can see here, and I'll have a much better graphic next. Don't bother yourself trying to read this. But yeah, this question that Berg and Scoggin wrote in their 1948 report, that without an understanding of the circumstance of residence, our knowledge of Hell's Midden cannot be complete. So that's what I was trying to get at here. So those are those same values. I took a percentile rank for each of these variables and then made a mean rank here on the end. This is the level designations used in 49 and 48 following that scheme. Green means high sedentism. Red means a lot less, okay? Yellow somewhere in the middle. What you can see here is, yes, this upper horizon, Fremont, very highly ranked. It makes sense. I mean, it's just incredibly dense deposits to be expected. Here in 1948, remember, that's the trench that went straight through the Midden. We don't have very good evidence in these layers, but in 1949, back up against the shelter wall, we do. What is that suggesting? Well, that suggests that archaeologists really aren't paleocultural anthropologists. The environment is fighting us. The environment is taking these sites and jumbling it all up and making it much harder to interpret some of this stuff, right? So we have good evidence for sedentism beneath the shelter, but out here where it was more exposed, a lot of that stuff is washed away. So this is just kind of humbling, I think, for me to think, man, if all I had was this 48 excavation season and I did the same thing, my results would be totally different, right? So the environment is acting on this stuff as much as humans are. But what we see, I mean, this record of sedentism really fits the regional record. Historically, we have accounts of Shoshone people using the Yampa River to seasonally extract wild carrot. The name Yampa actually comes from the Shoshonean word for wild carrot. And Fremont described those folks doing that along the river. The archaeological record shows this as well. The Middle Archaic, you see a big explosion in residential architecture, all of these kind of more solid markers for sedentary lifeways, right? And the groundstone tools, all of that, that suggests that people are coming back to this place to dwell seasonally, probably. And that makes good sense to me. So now just concluding on some of those and some of my kind of wild hair ideas. Do people have questions so far? Everybody's tracking more or less? Okay, good enough, good enough. So yeah, through the Middle Archaic, Hell's Midden shows high sedentism. The trouble with that is, what the hell does sedentism mean? I don't know, I can't tell you, but it could be that they were occupying the site very frequently. It could be that when they occupied the site, they stayed there for a long time. Or it could be also they came to this site and had a ton of people on that site dwelling there all at once. All of those things would give us basically the same picture that we're left with today. So teasing that out would require some more data. But the scrapers and awls at these sites, that suggests they were being used in the winter months, right? This is the record if you look at this stuff ecologically, big game species in this region, migratory big game species, elk and deer, this is exactly what they're doing. In the winter, they move to the river lowlands where there's a lot of plant food, much warmer temperatures. It's a way better place to hang out. And I hope this isn't news to anybody, but you all are migratory big game species. And so it kind of makes sense that we would be doing that same thing. And then, you know, larger groups would be aggregating in these river bottoms. And in the summer months, those groups would split apart, probably into smaller bands, smaller hunting groups, and disperse, right? Again, the historic accounts of Shoshone folks using the rivers in this way. And particularly north of the Yampa River, you see a lot of heavy plant processing being done in the winter and fall during the Archaic era. So this really fits in really nicely to that data. So the Fremont occupations, man, when they move in, I mean, corn farming, that's a different kind of thing. You probably want to watch your fields, particularly when you have just such large population across the broader landscape, right? Your tribe or your familial group or however it was broken up back then, you know, you might have been actually kind of pressed and forced to stay in these areas because other river canyons were just equally as occupied. It was very difficult to move around. They didn't have the same kind of freedom of movement of earlier periods. Right. What we don't see that I mentioned is that late Archaic to early agricultural transition. What was going on there? You know, it would be really nice to know if this was a group migrating in, if this was just technology migrating in, how exactly that happened. But it was totally erased. And I'll go back to the profile to show you how that happened here, because here's the top of that lower sequence where the Fremont occupations start digging into these levels. So it's not hard to imagine how they could have erased a big portion of what was then the site surface, right? It could have been by clearing weeds off the surface of the Midden, and all these things to make it more habitable. Okay, so now why aren't there caves? Why don't we have archaic deposits in these caves? And I have an idea. So now I'm going to try to summarize all of this, bring in my kind of wild hair ideas about neolithization and persistent places and how these are formed. Because Hell's Midden clearly is a persistent place on the landscape. It's some place that was somehow held in social memory. People knew to go and revisit that place, right? Evidence for that is like the caches, right? If you are caching goods at a site, caching these handstones, perfectly usable as they are, but people are making the choice to leave these on the site, thinking, oh, you know, I'm going to be back here next year. I'm going to need some handstones, so I'm going to cache those there, right? Other things like fire features or possibly occupation features that we can't see today, right? All of those things would have been investments into this site that makes it easier for future people to come and use this. I'll try to use a modern analogy. There's a ton of modern analogies for how site formation like this works. But think about, for example, a 2-track across open prairie, right? The first time somebody takes their truck across that open prairie, they're putting a lot of risk to their tires, right? And maybe they'll hit a stump or something like this that would cause trouble for them. But if they made it okay, somebody who comes to that 2-track later, hey, I'm not going to blaze myself a new track. This person already ran this, so I'm going to go through here, right? The construction of features, leaving of cache goods is a very similar process. Another personal example came up earlier this week. I went fishing in Florence, and obviously them building the pond, well, that encourages reuse of that site. But somebody had left, they didn't clean up, right? And they left some fruit smiles, little fruit snacks on my fishing pad. And I was getting ready to go before I found these. I thought, oh, there's fruit smiles here. Well, I'll eat these and I can keep fishing a little while longer. So that's how, even unintentionally, right, people being on a site and leaving their trash behind, that trash could be useful to people in the future. And it encourages reuse, 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 right? More reuse encourages more reuse and so on and so forth. Other examples I have here, yeah, indigenous trail systems becoming our modern roadways. Cities like Tenochtitlan, you know, you go and conquer this place. You're not going to go to all the effort of building a whole new capital city. You think, man, they put a lot of work into this place. They already got the canals and all this. I guess we'll just move in here, right? Or campsites, party sites in the woods, right? So that basically just goes over what I was just saying. But one thing that's really interesting in the literature, when people talk about persistent places like this, and they talk about hunter-gatherer folks caching, you know, I'm caching my groundstones here so that I can come back. There's always this kind of unspoken assumption that when people are caching at a site like Hell's Midden, they're caching for their own private use. They're saying, I'm leaving this here so that when my family returns, I'm going to be able to reuse this stuff. I don't think that's supported at all, because why would you be choosing such prominent locations on the landscape to be leaving your stuff behind? It seems more like it's not conceived of in private terms. Are people tracking what I'm saying? That it wasn't just you leaving that for your family in the future. It's I'm going to leave this here because then anybody who comes by in the future will have an easier time, right? The fruit smiles, that was unintentional. Nobody thought I'm going to leave this here so when I come back tomorrow, I'll have old sun-beaten fruit stacks, you know? But it made it a more habitable spot for me, is all I'm trying to say. So reuse, incentivize reuse, but then Fremont folks come along. And what's the deal? They slip into this stream of reuse. Hey, this Castle Park site is sweet. Hey, man, there's all kinds of old, you know, spear points lying around. We can refashion these into arrow points. Or there's all these kind of fire features. Hey, let's just blow out the ash and start our own fire here. All these people have put so much work. Gosh, it makes us easier for us Fremont people. But you start to see another thing with these agricultural societies, particularly the Fremont kind of rise up on this landscape. You see totally new regimes of land use. Part of that is really intense evidence for territoriality. Right? You see this in granaries. Can anybody spot the granary in this photo? There is one. It's really, really tricky. Right here. Way up on this cliff wall. Right? Well, that's not stopping a pack rat from getting that. But that does make it really hard for a human from the next village over to come and raid your stores. And if you see him climbing up that cliff wall, you know, one arrow to the back will dispatch him. Right? You see other stuff in certain villages. You begin to see granaries actually moving from public spaces to private homes. You see homes being constructed with apparently unused wings that people have theorized were just to make a grander, larger kind of house within this village that could have been occupied by somebody who held a role of prestige of some kind in that society. The rock art, we have, John's got it on the back of his shirt, the McConkey Ranch rock art, this vernal style Fremont rock art, shows dudes with, you know, headhunters holding the severed heads of other folks, lots of violence and things like this, right? And you also see cave caches. Here's an example of some of that prestigious rock art. This is from Sago Canyon. These have been interpreted as actually these individuals could come back and add tally marks to their jewelry here as maybe some kind of war honor or something like that. Of course, that's all somewhat speculative, but you definitely see this prestige machismo kind of thing rising up in Fremont society at that time. So my questioning is, do we not have these caches within caves pre-Fremont because the Fremont brought this idea of a private good, right? By taking the caches and moving them from real prominent, easy to access spots along the river like Hell's Midden. You can access it from Hell's Canyon, coming from either side of the Yampa River, it's right there, right? The Fremont come in and all of their caching moves into these cave sites, right? Is this a way of Fremont folks in the bottoms controlling access to who gets to those caches? Who's able to access this religious paraphernalia, however you want to think of this, really obviously elaborate kind of materials that are left in these caves, right? And so do the Fremont and their kind of Neolithic, agricultural, all these ideas, the establishment of hierarchy in society, are they trying to control access to some of their materials by stashing it away in the caves that hadn't happened in previous times? That is basically my talk, y'all. I want to give thanks to all the people who funded my research, PAHS and the CCPA, Loveland Archaeological Society. I want to thank my family for being here and all of you all for being here. It's just such a kick seeing everybody. And yeah, I hope that was good. Thanks. Happy to answer questions if folks have questions, I imagine. Midden. Yep. Okay. Okay. The question is, what is a midden? Right? The site Hell's Midden. And this was something I just mentioned in passing at the very beginning of the talk. But a midden is just a trash deposit. And so a lot of times you see these under big village sites, particularly in the Southwest, where you have the village kind of inside this cave, and then you have a big dump of refuse spilling out from there, right? When they first saw this site, I mean, just the way it looks on the landscape, they saw it and thought it was a midden. As I've kind of, I hope, demonstrated somewhat, it was a primary occupation surface, not a midden, but I'm stuck with the name. Yeah, it sounds better than 5MF16 in my opinion. So I hope that answered it. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, if they're snare slides or not might be debatable. Some of them we have on snares, but it's basically a piece of bird bone, any kind of bone, typically bird bone, cut into a tube. It's incised along one end. And so they would have had cordage that ran through that slip and tied back to it. And so it's basically the piece that's, yeah, reducing friction on the cord and just letting that bone slide and catching any poor hapless little critters, you know. Yes, Sylvia. $1 million question there, Sylvia. She said, can you tell if the archaic people were ancestral to the Fremont? And that's really the enigma of the Fremont, is that we don't know where they came from and we don't know where they went. The tribes out there do not claim them for the most part, which to me, I think is I think that might be evidence for some of this machismo, real jerkish kind of hierarchical behavior. Forget those Fremont dudes. Yes. Uh-huh.
Survival of DNA.
You could potentially do studies of the soil. There's no human remains from this site. Could potentially, but the way that the kind of political climate is, you wouldn't really go after that. I mean, the indigenous folks just aren't really interested in those kind of questions. And so typically we wouldn't be, yeah, kind of looking at that. Okay. Yes, you do see Puebloan stuff, black on white pottery. Oh, sorry. The question was any evidence of Fremont trading with other contemporary groups. And you do see that. You definitely see within Fremont culture in trading amongst them. And so a lot of ink's been spilled on kind of Fremont trade fairs that could have happened certain times of year, where they were trading ceramics from certain production centers and then spreading those across the whole Fremont range. But yes, there is evidence of some of that. Uh-huh. Yes.
Consulted or anybody along the way, a geomorphologist, this stratigraphy there?
No.
It just seems like be strictly anthropogenic.
Right.
How much you got above your major Fremont exit.
This 50 centimeters up top. Uh-huh. Yeah, it's weird. Yeah. No, it is very bizarre. Yeah, no, the question was, has a geomorphologist looked at these strata, or the stratigraphic sequence here? The answer is no. In one season they did, I don't know offhand which, but yes, they did.
And certainly down below, you've got sand and silt layers.
Yes, right. Yes, and right here below, that's like that 350 centimeter mark I was talking. Below that, it definitely seems to be a lot of non-cultural levels. Yeah, but it's confusing too, because these are all jumbled up.
Dates out of sequence, you know.
Yes, there's one. Let me see. There's one. No, no, and it's from that. Oh, that was the slide. Yeah, this right here, 547 is the median calibrated there, AD. And that's kind of out of sequence because that is within this level that's otherwise 1000 AD. Yeah. And the issue is we don't have horizontal provenience on hardly any of this stuff. So beyond the distinction between 49 and 48, I don't know how far north, you know, how far out of the Midden or of the shelter it was, these things were taken from.
Fan coming off.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of environment.
Yeah, right. And clear, this is the highest portion of the Midden. I don't have like a full topo of the entire thing, but this here, it definitely seems like there's some funneling from that upper surface that's just depositing a ton of stuff there. Particularly since you have all this newspaper from this Pat Lynch horizon. You know, even though that was just the 1880s, seems like, man, that would have had to get covered up pretty quick for newspaper to just be sitting more or less exposed. Yeah.
You can't pick out paleosols. You just have like look like living layers.
Yeah.
You know, like soil development.
Right. Yeah. Not really. And I think part of it is that when folks did eventually reoccupy, something I would guess jumbled it up is them pulling all the veg off the surface. They're just these huge sagebrush that the archaeologists, when they were living on the site, you know, had to rip up. So surely people before them did too. Yeah. Right. Yes, John. The only really nearby one is a deluge shelter is another one to look at. Oh, and sorry, the question was, do the strata here mirror any other sites in the area? And they're pretty rare. Deluge shelter, which is just the other side of the state line with Utah and Dinosaur, looks very similar, slightly older. There's a Hell Gap component there, so a late Paleo component at the very bottom. But like this site, their late Archaic, early formative transition is removed. There's that whole sequence from 1000 BC to 1000 AD is basically missing. So similar in that way. Yeah. Doug asked, are there plans to go back and dig? The site is actually on private land. It was the Mantles Ranch, which some of y'all might have remembered big fights with the federal government to hold that land because it's totally encircled by Dinosaur National Monument. It recently sold for like $14 million or something insane. So no, I'd like to. Yeah, I'd like to. I haven't made contact. Yeah. Kate. Slide 28.
Did you know what that's there currently?
This one. Is it this one?
Oh,
This one? Okay, yeah. So I didn't really use this as a reference, but this was just when I was talking about how, you know, people investing in a site makes it really favorable for later people to come. Here, you can see this cactus flat area. Whoever this person was that originally cleared the cactus from that. Well, dang, that makes that look, 20 times better than any other plot of land next to it. So I was just trying to show there that that cleared area would have been a small investment someone made that made it easier for later folks.
Is that city?
This is, oh, the city. Oh, you're asking, this is, yes, Mexico City. Exactly. Yes. Uh-huh. Yes. Yeah, and that's another real sticker. You guys are asking good questions. I just talked about it as sedentism because I didn't really want to get into the weeds. But like I say, I mean, the record that we're seeing could be from a short stay by a ton of people or a lengthier stay by much fewer people, right? It's really tough to know. I don't know. Similar Fremont villages. Castle Park doesn't really look like a Fremont village per se, but upwards of getting to 100 people, something like that would be a pretty typical size. For the archaic period, no idea.
I can make a comment about that. That's one of my bugaboos. You know that little trenches that they excavate.
Exactly. Yes. 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 So Mike's comment was just that all we know from this site is that one trench. And that was where I was showing in that one slide. If all I had was one of those years versus the other, my interpretation would be radically different. So it's really important to, stay humble about that. Memento mori. Yes. Yep. For this region, there was some fluctuation in precipitation, kind of the general trend you see, but as far as available species and things like that, it doesn't look like it changed enough to affect those. Yeah. The question was, is the environment the same? I don't know if I said that.
You just mentioned about the trenches. So if you could dig another trench 10 feet either direction of the current trenches, then you could compare what you find in those trenches versus what you've got from the other.
Right.
And that's something that you're not able to do.
But it would just be a longer term thing. I mean, I just had to keep it discreet so I could get out of grad school. But the question was, if you went back in the future, would you hit other areas of the site? And I think yes. And there's some sites. I mean, this trenching method of digging one trench straight through and then one kind of perpendicular against the shelter wall was very common in that day. The first thing you'd have to sort out, though, is how has that thing changed since? Because that 2 meter by 10 meter by 5 meter exposed trench was never backfilled. So that site has surely now slumped, all those things jumbled in together. There's cool work done in caves in Texas, like the Eagle Rock Shelter, where they're able to go in and with really fine stratigraphy, retrace how that stuff has been affected since earlier excavations. That's what I would want to do, is to go back to the levels that they were actually seeing and get finer vertical resolution on them and horizontal resolution. Yeah. Because here it was just crummy. I didn't really mention that. Most of these levels were dug in 30 centimeter levels, which is freaking huge. I mean, that's a lot to be grouping into one thing. Yes, Catherine. Yes. Yes, it was. And they did not find any evidence of that village they thought would be up there. There's no soil. I mean, and that's kind of the character of this entire region, is that the uplands just have absolutely no soil. They're entirely an erosional environment. The river bottoms is entirely depositional. So the only place that, buried strata like that could exist would be in those river bottoms. Up top, was there a village? Who knows? They didn't find it. Yeah. Cool. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, you all back home.
Hey, don't forget, next month, May 4th, Jared